I was initially going to go over the homework first and then do the lesson. But I think because I want to wait for as many people to remember to show up as possible before I go over the homework, we will save the homework till the end. So if we get to, this class ends at 7:05. If we get to 6:55 and I haven't started talking about the homework yet, start throwing things at the screen and telling me to start talking about the homework. I just want to briefly talk about homework 2, go over the answers. On the whole, you all did really, really well. I was very happy with it. There were a couple that tricked a lot of people, but on the whole, people did very nicely. So yay. And the other good news is you have no homework this weekend, so you won't have anything to do. You can enjoy your weekend off, or I guess the end of your week off. So what that means is today's class is going to be reasoning well. So basically what we're going to take from last time. Last time we just talked about arguments in general. What makes an argument, premises, conclusions, how to identify what the premises are, how to identify what the conclusions are. This time we're going to move in the next step because like so many other things, reasoning and using arguments in your thought and speech is something that you can do well and something you can do poorly. And so what we're going to talk about this class and into next class is how do you do it well? What makes reasoning well? What is it that defines this? But before we do that, let's just first talk about why the hell you would want to reason well and why reasoning well is a valuable thing to do. Well, what did I say reasoning was last time, or what is the goal? What is it to reason? Well, it's to take things that you already know are true and get new knowledge, or you combine them together to get new pieces of knowledge. So it's thinking one thing you know to be true, taking another thing you know to be true, and then from there, combining them together to find out something new. And that is a really useful skill because, knowledge is power. If you know something, you have an advantage over somebody else who doesn't know that same thing. Or you have an advantage over yourself if you didn't know that thing. So for instance, there's probably a, let's see if I can come up with a timely example. Well, here's the thing. Small children often have this, why do you have to keep small children away from things like outlets and hot surfaces? What do you have that the child doesn't?
A sense of what's going to happen?
Yeah, you know what's going to happen. What happens if you shove your finger in an electrical outlet? Has anyone done it before other than me? Has anyone ever accidentally grabbed, I was taking a plug out and I grabbed it by the little metal part. So am I the only one who's electrocuted themselves?
No, I've done it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you kind of get that weird tingling feeling up your arm as you're oh, this is not a good thing. So that's something I now know not to do that. Or don't eat 5-day-old sushi. That's something else a person can learn. If you don't know that raw fish goes bad and you end up throwing up everywhere, now you do know that. So this is why. So reasoning well is important because you can find out what's true and what's false. Also, if you know how to reason well, you'll know when people are trying to convince you of something by reasoning poorly. And since reasoning well is the only way to get from some truths to other truths, if somebody's reasoning poorly, the conclusion they want you to draw likely isn't a good one. So it's also a way of making sure that you are able to identify when somebody is, giving you a crappy argument. So you can know, oh, that's a crappy argument. I shouldn't believe that. I should form my own conclusion. So that's why we're reasoning well. Now, what goes into reasoning well? Well, all reasoning well basically consists of it's just constructing a certain type of argument. And it's basically constructing a good argument. Now, what makes a good argument or reasoning? What is it to reason well? Well, I think the easiest way to demonstrate this is with an analogy to cooking. I think the easiest way to recognize what it is to reason well is to compare it in a case of what goes into cooking a good meal and highlight the things that they have in common. So when you're cooking, what defines whether you did a good job? It's a very simple test.
If it tastes good?
Bingo. What is it to cook well? You end up with a product that tastes good. So you end up with something that is like a tasty meal. Now, reasoning well is the same thing. There's something you want at the end. Something you want, and what do you want? A truth. You want to find out something that you didn't know before. Truth / piece of new knowledge. So in the same way, you know something's gone wrong with your meal if it tastes like crap or you get sick. Something went wrong. If you end up with something that's false or something that you don't now, like you don't know for certain, or something that, isn't a good conclusion to reach, that's what it is to reason poorly. So in both cases, there's very clear statements of what getting it right or doing it well is and what getting it wrong or doing it poorly is. Now, in both cases, cooking and reasoning, there are two things that go into doing it well. If you want a tasty meal at the end, what two things do you need to do?
Season it.
So this is a more specific sort of answer, but seasoning goes into what? What elements, even with seasoning, if you're adding seasoning, there's two things you have to get right with the seasoning.
Flavor.
So the flavor has to be right. And so what makes the right flavor?
Measurements.
Yeah, so it's the amount that you're supposed to put in. You can't put in too much. You can't put in too little. You have to follow, if there's a recipe, you have to get the amount correct. So the first part of cooking well is you have to follow recipe. It can be your own recipe or somebody else's recipe. Basically, you need to make sure that you're doing the right steps in the right order, in the right way. But that's not all that goes into it. You can get the best recipe in the world. Say you're making a chicken dinner and you have the best recipe. All your seasoning is just perfect. You've cooked this 1,000 times. You know how to do it. Are you guaranteed to end up with a delicious meal?
No.
What could have gone wrong?
You overcook something.
So imagine that you don't overcook it. You cooked it the perfect amount. Where could it have gone wrong?
The season.
Right. Imagine that.
Plating?
Say that again, Nicole.
Plating, like the plating of it.
So not the plating. Let's go back to the very start. What's the first thing you have to do to cook this meal?
When you get the chicken.
You get the chicken. Imagine that I tell you I have the best recipe, and you ask, "Oh, and where'd you get the chicken?" And I say, "I found it in the dumpster." Is it going to be a tasty meal? Probably not. Why? Because the ingredients are rotten and are going to make you sick and are going to taste like garbage. So no matter how good a recipe is, no matter how well you follow it, no matter how well your skill is, the first thing that you need for a good meal are good ingredients. So it's not just the recipe and that you follow the recipe. So you have to know the recipe, follow it, do everything you're supposed to do, but you better start with damn good ingredients. Because if you start with a rotten piece of chicken, even the best chef in the world is not going to be able to turn a piece of garbage into something that tastes good. If you literally tried to throw out a piece of chicken, missed the trash can, and it stayed in the kitchen for 6 weeks, and then you cooked it, nothing you're going to do is going to make it okay. It's impossible. Now, pulling over to reasoning, it's the same thing. For reasoning to go well, you need to have it's something like a recipe, or in this case, you need to have something along the lines of, what's the best way of putting this? Follow correct principles. So just like you have to follow a recipe, you have to know what the recipe is and follow it correctly. In reasoning, you need to know what the principles of good reasoning are, and you need to follow them correctly. Now, what those principles are and what sorts of things are good reasons and bad reasons, we'll talk about more. But the first thing you have to do is follow the correct ingredients. But that alone isn't going to be enough, or follow the correct principles, the correct instructions. That alone isn't enough. You also need good ingredients. So in this case, you need good, which when we are doing an argument, last time we said there are two parts. There's the premises, which are the thing you start with, and then the thing that it spits out at the end. So the thing at the end is the conclusion. So to get a good conclusion, you need good premises. So in both a recipe, or both cooking and reasoning, you need the recipe or the principles you follow, and then you need the ingredients. In one case, the ingredients is food. In the other case, the ingredients is premises. So that's another way they're the same. And if you follow the correct principles, use good premises, you'll get a new truth, something you can learn and know is the case. If you start with good ingredients and follow a good recipe, you'll end up with a tasty meal. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is what makes something the correct principles? How do you know that the principles are a good one? How can you test that they're good ones? Well, in the same way, it's the same test you can do for a recipe. If you're testing a recipe, how do you test whether it's a good recipe or not? What can you do to make sure it's a good recipe? Well, what do?
You taste as you go along.
You taste it as you go along. It's basically what you do is you just do the recipe. You follow the recipe. If the thing you end up with at the end sucks, it wasn't a good recipe if you had good ingredients. If, however, you start with good ingredients and you follow the recipe, then you know it's a good meal. So the way you test a recipe is you start with good. Step 1, start with good ingredients. Step 2, cook. Step 3, taste. If it's good, it's a good recipe. So, in a recipe, basically what you do is you start with good ingredients, and once you're sure you've got good ingredients, you then cook it, and you and assuming you did it well and you followed the instructions correctly, or to tell, I guess, rather than talking about a good recipe, did you do a good job of cooking? Well, you can tell if you did a good job of cooking if the outcome is tasty. So the way you test it is step 1, you make sure that you have good ingredients. And if you end up with a tasty thing at the end, or if you start with good ingredients and you cook it right, there's no way for it to have been a bad recipe. A good recipe is something that's guaranteed that if you follow the directions properly and you start with good ingredients, you are guaranteed to have a good meal. There's no way to end up with a bad meal if you do it well, if you cook well, and your ingredients didn't suck. In the same way with reasoning, if you start with true premises and you follow good principles, step 3, you is conclusion true? So the basic way, the way in both a cooking and in an argument or in reasoning, the way you tell whether your reasoning is good is step 1, make sure your ingredients are good. So in step 1 for food, check your foods you're starting with. They're not rotten, they're good quality. With this, you check your premises. Are they good premises? Then, if you want to know if the principles laid out in that argument are good, or if you want to know whether the steps in your cooking were good, you look at the end and see, is it possible for my cooking, or is it possible for my food to taste crappy? Well, it's not possible for my food to taste crappy if the recipe was a good one and I followed it correctly. In the same way, is it possible for my conclusion to be false? Well, it shouldn't. In a good reasoning, it's impossible for your conclusion to be false if the principles are good ones and you follow them correctly. So this is how you test whether an argument is a good one. And the way an argument is a good one, as we said, is you start with things that are true and you get more truths. In the same way as cooking, you start with good ingredients, you end up with a good outcome. So what I want to talk about for the rest of class, but does everyone understand just like the general idea? Very often we think that all it takes for reasoning to be good is, does it seem okay? Does it yada yada? But in the same way, you need to think about what you start with and how you do it. They're two separate parts, both of them that can be analyzed separately. In the same way as with cooking, you need to think about the recipe on the one hand and the ingredients, and they're both judged separately. Whether the ingredients are good has nothing to do with whether the recipe itself and your steps were good. And whether you followed the correct steps has nothing to do with whether the recipe or whether the ingredients were good. At the end of the day, it's the two of them together working hand in hand that makes for a tasty meal. In the same way, it's good premises combined with good reasoning principles that make for a good argument and a successful conclusion. So we have to think of them always as both cooking and reasoning as having two distinct parts, each of which can be analyzed separately. So does this make sense to everybody? Just the general idea of there's two different parts. All right. I'm going to leave this up here for 1 second and take a sip of water. I'm then going to erase this, and then we will jump into, well, what makes for true premises and what makes for good principles of reasoning.
Sorry, so by principles, you just mean like the execution of your argument, like how you structure it?
How you structure it. And we're going to get into that a lot more in a little bit, Nicole.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, at this point, it's just like the bird's eye view of what this involves. So, the first thing I want to talk about is what makes a good premise. Basically, all that makes a good premise is that it's true. A good premise is a premise that states a true statement. That's all it is. Sometimes you won't be certain, 100% certain it's true, but almost as long as, like, in some cases, so you might say something like, there are more rats in New York City than giraffes. I don't know that for certain, that there are more rats in New York City than giraffes. I've never counted them, but I'd be willing to bet. And I bet all of you would be willing to accept that there's almost certainly more rats living in New York City in the 5 boroughs than there are giraffes. There's probably like, I don't know, 5 giraffes, 6 giraffes, and a lot more rats than that. So in this case, ideally it's true, but sometimes you can do an argument as long as it's almost certain to be true. You don't have to have 100% like guaranteed certainty. What you don't want is something that's obviously false. So if I'm making an argument and I'm beginning with something like, I'm the tallest person in the world. Because I'm the tallest person in the world, I can see over everybody. So that's proof I can see over everybody. That's not a good argument. Why? Because I'm pretty damn sure I'm not the tallest person in the world. So a good premise is one that's true, or at the very least, almost certain to be true. So that's all it means. In food, there's a lot more of identifying whether it's a good ingredient than just, truth or falsity. It's pretty straightforward. Is it true? Is it false? If it's false, bad way to start your argument. If it's true, good way to start your argument. And again, we can't know for certain always, but that's all it means for a good premise. So does that make sense to everybody? Just that's all it is. So, and you can think about it like in your everyday life. If you're trying to prove to someone why they should buy one product over another, you're not just going to make up shit about the product. You're going to be like, well, let me tell you, this marker lasts 3 times as long as that marker. You're not going to be like, this marker can cure cancer if it can't, because then they'll sue you. So you start with true statements. Now, there are a couple things I want to highlight here. And we'll come back to this more next week, but there's really just one thing I want to highlight, which is what makes an if then true. So very often in arguments, you will see one of the premises in the form if X then Y. So for instance, In the homework number 1, or in the homework, question number 1 was, no, this marker's dead. If you have COVID, then, oh wait, no, it's the other way around. If you lose your sense of smell, you lose your sense of smell, then you have COVID. Now, this is a slightly different version than was in the homework. There was a probably in there, but I want to take it out for this. So this is an if-then statement. If-then statements, when people look at them, can often think that we're thinking of them as 2 separate premises, or 2, and in a sense, there are 2 sentences here. One of them is, you lose your sense of smell and you have COVID. But when you combine them together in this, it's 1 sentence and only 1 premise. So at first glance, you might think, what is it for an if-then statement to be true? Like, how could it be true or false? You don't know for certain that you lost a sense of smell. What does this mean? Well, you can actually ask yourself in a whole statement, an if-then statement is the sort of thing that can be true or false. What does it take for an if-then statement to be true? Does anyone know? If I tell you, if you lose your sense of smell, then you have COVID. So the way to show that an if-then statement is going to be true so long as it's not false, because if something's not true, it's false. Does that make sense? It's just like those are 2 options. Something's either true or it's false. So this statement is either going to be true or false. What would it take to show that this statement is false? To use a simpler example, if a number is even, then it's divisible by 3. This is an if-then statement that is false. How do you know that this is false? How do you prove that this if-then statement is false?
Because 3 doesn't go into to even numbers.
Yeah, so what you can do is you just come up with an example that of a number that is even and is not divisible by 3. So give me an example of a number that is even but not divisible by 3.
20.
Yeah, 20. 20 is a number that is even. 20 is even. It is divisible by 2, but it is not divisible by 3. So that proves that this if-then statement is false. So what it is for an if-then statement to be false is the only way to show an if-then statement is false is to show that there's the first part of it is true, but the second part is false. So in a case like this, how do you know that if you lose your sense of smell, then you have COVID? Well, can we be certain that this is true? Well, the way we test whether it's true or not is we'd see if we could find an example of somebody who has lost their sense of smell but doesn't have COVID. So if you lose your sense of smell, then you, where's this one? Must have COVID. Now, this is another if-then statement. If you lose your sense of smell, then you must have COVID. How would we disprove this? This is also a false statement. What is it about this if-then statement? How could you show that? Who would you have to find to disprove this statement?
Someone who's sick that doesn't have COVID but has no sense of smell.
Yeah, somebody who's sick and lost their sense of smell, but without having COVID. I also met someone once who had fainted, fell on the back of her head, damaged her brain, and could never again smell. So that's another way. So she is another counterexample to this. So basically, if you see in the premise a statement like, if you see an argument that goes something like this, if you have hair, then you're a mammal if you're a mammal, you aren't a rock. So 3, if you have hair, you aren't a rock. Now, the way you'll often see arguments with these sorts of if-thens. Another version is something like, if you have hair, then you're a mammal. John has hair, therefore John is, or if you have hair, then you're a mammal. John has hair, therefore John is a mammal. That would be another sort of argument. In each case, though, for a premise with the form if-then to be true, to be a good premise in the argument, it has to be the case that anytime the first one is true, the first clause of this, the second one also has to be true. It's going to be false if the first part is true and the second part is false. We'll come back to this more next class. We'll be talking about this a lot more, but I just wanted to highlight this here of what it is for an argument to have a good if-then statement in it. So does this make sense to everyone? In some sense, this is common sense because we all reason like this all the time. If somebody tells you, well, if LeBron was playing tonight, the Lakers would have won. You would say something in response like, if LeBron had played tonight, the Clippers were playing so well, he wouldn't have made any difference. So even if he had played, they still would have lost. That's how you disagree with that if-then statement. All right, so that's the first bit. Any questions on that? We doing all right? Okay, awesome. Give me 1 second to pull up my note because my computer keeps closing. So that's the first bit. Now the rest of class is going to be spent talking about the what makes for good reasoning principles. So, what is it that makes for good reasoning principles? Answer: valid argument structure. What is valid argument structure? If the premises are true, conclusion must be true. Another way of saying this same thing is or cannot have true premises and false conclusion. These are two ways of saying the same thing. So, what is it for an argument structure, or what is it to reason well? What is it to make sure that the principles of reasoning you're using are good ones? Well, it means that you've got an argument structure that's valid. And what is it for an argument structure to be valid? Well, all it means for an argument structure to be valid is that if you start with true premises, you're guaranteed a true conclusion. And this is, again, just like in the case of the recipe. What is it to be a good recipe? Well, it is if you start with good ingredients and follow the recipe correctly, you are guaranteed to have a good meal. If it's a bad recipe, even if you follow it perfectly, it can go wrong. In the same way, if it's a bad argument, if you have true premises, but the conclusion could still be false, it's a bad argument. It's what we would call invalid. So this right here is the key term, this notion of valid. So all it is for something to be valid is if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. So this, in the same way as with a recipe, you cannot tell whether something is valid or not if you start with false premises. So, just in the same way, you can't tell if a recipe is good if you start with rotten ingredients. Rather, you have to test if my ingredients are good. Am I guaranteed to have a good conclusion, a true statement? Well, if yes, then I've got a valid argument. If no, then I don't have a valid argument. So that's all we mean by validity, where if the premises are true, then conclusion guaranteed. So let's just, it might be a little easier to explain what I mean by this by looking at a couple of examples of what a valid argument looks like. So to start with a clear case, here is a perfectly valid mathematical argument. 1, if a number is divisible by 2, it's even. 2, 24 is divisible by 2. Conclusion. Well, what conclusion can we draw from these two premises? If this is true, which it is, and this one's true, which it is, what new piece of knowledge could you learn that you didn't have before? Or to give a better example, 1, 1, 3, 6, 4, 4, 2, 4. 1, 3, 1, 1, 3, 6, 4, 4, 2, 4 is divisible by 2. So what can we conclude now that you probably didn't know before?
The number is even.
Yeah, that 1, 1, 3, 6, 4, 4, 2, 4 is even. Now, this isn't a piece of information that's going to be that useful to you, but it's a piece of information that you got, which you didn't have before. And is this a valid argument? And valid here meaning if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So we know this is true, and we know this is true. Is there any way for this not to be true? Is there a magical world in which this number isn't even? Is there some mythical place? Is there some drug we can get on in which this number ceases to be even? No, no matter what, this is going to be true. So we know that this statement is a valid argument. This is true, therefore this is guaranteed to be true. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's go with another one. So, if I this is to try to pull apart the key notion that validity is different from whether the overall argument is successful. So remember we said there are two different bits, being valid, which is just a matter of having a good structure, versus being churning out a true conclusion. You can be a valid argument even if the conclusion turns out badly. Why? Well, because the structure can be good even if the premises aren't true. So here's going to be an example. I'm a bird. If something is a bird, then it has feathers. Conclusion. Well, what's the conclusion from this? What conclusion?
Feathers?
Yeah, I have feathers. Now, is this argument valid? So this is a tricky one that kind of goes against common sense. Is this argument valid? Yes, it is a valid argument in the sense that we will be using this term here. Yes, this is valid. Why is this valid? Anyone think they can give the explanation for it?
Is it because the two premises are related to each other and the conclusion?
Yeah, so the idea is, and it's not just that they're related in a way where if this were the case, if I really was a bird, if this were true and this were true, this would have to be true. There's no world in which I'm a bird and that that's a bird has feathers. Can it be the case that I don't have feathers? Now, this is not, however, a completely good argument. Why not? What's the obvious reason that this isn't a good argument?
Not all birds have feathers.
Well, less so. So that's questioning this one. And I actually don't know if all birds have feathers. That's a very good question. I mean, I guess you could rip all the feathers out of like a poor chicken. I think all birds have feathers though, as long as you don't like torture the poor buggers. What's the more obvious falsehood here?
You're not a bird.
I'm not a bird. I'm sorry to disappoint you all, but I'm not a bird. So this is not true. I am not actually a bird. Therefore, this is false. And because this is false and this is true, you're not guaranteed to get a true conclusion. It actually could turn out that I do have feathers, but that's still not a guaranteed way. An argument is valid when if the premises are true, the conclusion's true. In the same way as going back to our recipe example, if you start with rotten ingredients, then for this first one, even if you combine the rotten ingredients in the right way, you're still going to end up with something that you're not guaranteed to have a good meal. So that's what it is to be valid. So we have to differentiate three ideas here. One, valid. Two, sound. Three, invalid. So these two are opposites. If an argument is valid, then it's not invalid. If an argument is invalid, then it is not valid. So for an argument to be valid is if you cannot have true premises and a false conclusion. If it's invalid, that means you can have true premises and a false conclusion. Now, sound, what sound is it is valid plus true premises. So whenever you're arguing or whenever you're coming across an argument, this is what we ultimately want. We want arguments to be sound. We want arguments to be sound because that's the only way you're guaranteed to gain new knowledge. If you take something that's true already and you combine it with an argument that is guaranteed to give you a true conclusion if the premises are true, then you're guaranteed to get a true conclusion. You're guaranteed to learn something new. That's what we're ultimately looking for. But in order to show that something's sound, you need to have an understanding of what it is to be valid, and you need to become good at recognizing what counts as valid and what does not. Because if you don't understand validity, you're going to confuse things that look sound from things that aren't. If you accidentally, it is impossible for an argument to be sound if it's invalid. Because by definition, for an argument to be sound is for it to be valid with true premises. So to learn to make sure that your reasoning is sound and that you gain true knowledge, you gain information about the world, you need to learn to recognize when things are valid and when they are not. And there's certain argument structures that lend themselves to validity and which are always valid, and some structures which are never going to give you the right answer are always invalid. And what you need to learn to do is tell the difference between them so that then you can learn to argue in a way that is sound. So does this make sense? In the same way that with your recipe, you need to learn to treat recipes well or poorly and judge them well or poorly, regardless of ingredients. If you're a chef who never has access to the best ingredients and you want to do the best you can with what you're given, you need to learn to recognize what's a good recipe or a bad recipe independently of what ingredients you are given. So in the same way that if you look at a recipe, like if I was telling you, this is my recipe for here's my chocolate chip cookie recipe. Here's the ingredients you need. Add 25 pounds of chalk and 3 tree branches. If that's what I put in the recipe, like, you know that this is a bad recipe. You don't need to see whether I have good tree branches or high quality chalk. You can just look at the recipe and know it's bad. In the same way with reasoning, the goal is to learn to identify whether the structure is good, whether the reasoning principles are good, without having to look at what the premises are. So there's this way of learning to reason well. You learn to do both ingredients separately so that in practice you can learn to identify either one being wrong. So does this make overall sense to everyone? And validity is all about the structure of the argument. So what I want to do now is do a little bit more of separating validity from ending up with a true conclusion. So I just want to do a couple more examples to show ways in which just because you end up with a true conclusion does not mean that the argument is valid. Does this make sense? And the reason why is in the same way that you have to learn how to, if you want to reason well, you have to learn how to identify poor arguments. We want to learn how to identify good arguments, and don't be distracted by whether the conclusion is true or not. So does this make sense to everyone? Like what I'm going for here, just explaining the argument structures. So here is an argument structure that you might come across. Premise 1. All whales are mammals. Premise 2. Kevin is a I can't draw M's. Conclusion: Kevin is a whale. Now, this is an argument because of what we said last time. It's got 2 premises and it's got a conclusion that is designed. We can even put a therefore to really make it clear. Therefore, Kevin is a whale. This is an argument. Now, is this valid? So, what did we say is the definition of validity? What does it take for something to be valid? This is just a test of how many of you are there and alive.
That if both the premise are true, then the conclusion has to be true.
Exactly. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. So, can we imagine a case so here's how you test for validity. You think to yourself, can I think of a case in which both premises are true, but the conclusion is false? So can anyone think of a case in which that would be the case? Can we think of a case in which this is true and this is true, but the conclusion would be false?
If kangaroos are also mammals?
Yeah. What if Kevin's a kangaroo? Imagine Kevin's a kangaroo. Kevin is my pet kangaroo. If Kevin's my pet kangaroo, then is it the case that that all whales are mammals? Yes, this is still true. Is it the case that Kevin is a mammal? Well, yes, it is, because also kangaroos are mammals. Then this is true. But is it the case that Kevin is a whale? No, it's false because he's a kangaroo, and you can't be a kangaroo and a whale. Oh, that would be a really funny hybrid animal. Like, I guess it would just like jump along at the bottom of the ocean. If Kevin's my pet kangaroo, this can be true and this is false. So that means the overall argument is invalid. Any argument where the premises can be true and the conclusion is false, that's an invalid argument. So because it's invalid, you couldn't end up with this being a sound argument. So even if it were by happenstance that Kevin was a whale, imagine Kevin is, or let's change the name, Wally. And let me draw a picture of Wally. that's Wally. Wally is in fact a whale. So we have a true premise, two true premises, and as a matter of fact, we have a true conclusion. But does this make the argument valid? Does it make the argument valid? No, it does not. Validity is a matter of these have to be true, and this is also the case. So even if it just so happens that Wally is a whale, it doesn't mean the conclusion is guaranteed. So in the same way in which somebody could say, and you can think of cases in which this actually becomes practical. So for instance, this election did not go as, there wasn't a clear case of this. So I'm gonna actually have to go back to the 2016 election. And this is something that actually was said in amongst the Hillary Clinton campaign group. They said things like, if we win North Carolina, we win, or no, let's go. If we win Virginia, we will win the election. We won Virginia. Therefore, if this was a valid argument, it would have, if this were a valid argument, what would have to be the conclusion we could draw? What truth could we learn? If this were actually a good argument, where if this was true and this was true, this had to be true.
So we won the election?
Yep, that would be the conclusion. We won the election. And as a matter of fact, before the 2016 election happened, this sort of thing was being said amongst Hillary Clinton's campaign. But it turned out it was not a good argument. Why? Well, it did turn out that they won Virginia. Hillary won Virginia, I think. This might be slightly off, but imagine this is true. Hillary wins Virginia. However, who won the 2016 election? Come on, history lesson. You were all there. Yeah, Trump won. Why? Well, it turns out that this bit here. Actually, let me think about this. I may have just given a if we win the election, if we win Virginia, we win the election. This was also true. Where if, no, that wasn't true. Give me one sec. I'm confusing myself here. If we win Virginia, you know what? This is a crappy example. This is the one problem with logical reasoning. Sometimes you end up confusing yourself too much. The basic idea here is this was actually a, let me go back here. If we won Virginia, therefore conclusion, we won election. So is this a true, is this a sound argument? This is actually a good teaching example. Is this a sound argument?
No.
No. Why? Because it turned out that this ended up being false. Was this a valid argument?
Yes.
Yeah, because if this was the case and this were the case, then this would have to be the case. So this was a valid argument that wasn't sound. So this is a case in which the reason why is this turned out to be false. So this was the problem for the Hillary campaign. This first one was false. So this is still, if you have a false premise that causes you to have a false conclusion, that is not proof that your argument is invalid. You can have a valid argument even if you have a false premise. So again, this is just to show a way in which testing validity comes apart from soundness and comes apart from truth. This is just another way to highlight that you, when you're thinking about is an argument valid, don't think about what's actually the case. Think about what would be the case if the premises were true. It's a type of reasoning that is very valuable because it allows you to think about things that aren't really the case. So,
Professor,
yes.
I have a question.
Yep.
So if the premise matches the conclusion, then it'll be valid even if one of the premises are false. As long as the conclusion and at least one of the premises are false, then it'll be valid.
So your question is, if the premise one is just the same as the conclusion?
Yeah, or premise 2, if it, as long as it aligns with the conclusion at some point, that would make it valid.
So yeah, so let me show you a good case. Unicorns. I ate unicorn for lunch. Premise 1 is I'm named David. Conclusion, therefore, I'm named David. So in this case, this is indeed a valid argument. Why is it a valid argument? Well, this one is blatantly false. I did not eat unicorn for lunch, but this one is true. And not only is this one true, any case in which I'm named David is going to be a case in which I'm named David. So therefore, this argument is always going to be valid, because if this were true, if this is true and this is true, this is also going to be true. So yes, does that, Cassandra, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So that's a really clever thing to pick up on, is if your premise is the exact same thing as your conclusion, your argument is always valid. It's always valid to conclude something from itself, because you're gaining, but you can see this isn't all that useful because you're not actually gaining any information. Like if you say like, I stubbed my toe, therefore I stubbed my toe, it's like, or my mom is my mom, therefore my mom is my mom. It's just, you're not gaining any information here. But it is, technically speaking, always valid because the conclusion is guaranteed from this.
Sorry, this would also be sound, right?
This would actually be any sound to true premises. I actually don't think this one would be sound because
the second one's false.
Second one's false, yeah.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, this is almost irrelevant. So in some sense, you could think of it as tearing it off and just throwing it away. This is always sound, and well, this one would be sound, but that first one was not technically sound because the second premise was not true. I did not eat unicorn for lunch.
Okay.
All right. You can have, here's another, I think we did this one with the whale case, where another thing to stress, just always remember that just because the premises are true and the conclusion is true does not guarantee that it's a valid argument. So like, premise 1, it's not Monday. Premise 2, and we talked about one of these, but I just really want to hammer this one home. It's not Tuesday. Conclusion, therefore, it's Wednesday. Now, as a matter of fact, this is true, this is true, this is true, but it's not a valid argument. Why? Well, because just because this one's true and this one's true, we could end up with a false conclusion. Like, this is not guaranteed to be true. What would be the case if it were Thursday? Well, if it was Thursday, this would be true, this would be true, but that would be false. So does everyone understand that when you're thinking about validity, it's a matter of thinking, you have to think, it's almost like imagination. You have to imagine a case. Can you think of a case in which this is true and this is true, but the conclusion is false? If you can, then it is an invalid argument. If you can't think of a case in which this is true and this is true, but that's false, if this is true and this is true, this has to be true, then you're dealing with a valid argument. So is everyone just on board with these general sorts of things? This is just the key idea of validity. As I said at the start of class, there's not going to be a homework this weekend. So don't worry about mastering this. Next class, we're going to talk a lot more about sorts of arguments that are valid, because there's certain just structers that are automatically, you can quickly recognize, oh, that's a valid argument structure. And other ones which you can recognize very quickly of that kind of looks like a valid argument structure, but it's not ever going to be valid. And again, these are useful to identify, because if you're going out in the world and trying to identify, is this argument sound? Am I guaranteed to have a true conclusion? Then being able to recognize when something's a valid argument and when something's an invalid argument will allow you to more quickly identify whether, like in an article you're reading or a discussion you're having is giving you new information or not. So again, we'll be talking about this a lot more next time. So that's the first bit I wanted to talk about. If you've got any questions right now, though, feel free to ask. Any questions, comments, concerns, feelings. I'm just saying, if you're feeling confused, do not panic. That was the first bit, because we're going to have a whole nother class to talk about this stuff. I'm not discouraging you from asking questions. Always ask questions, always raise comments, concerns, anything. I just want to make sure that nobody's panicking. We all good?
Yep.
All right. So what we just talked about is what's called deductive reasoning. It's the practice of taking two conclusions that are guaranteed to be, or two premises which are guaranteed to be true, and reaching a conclusion that is therefore guaranteed to be true. Deductive reasoning is what we deal with validity and soundness and all that stuff. But I briefly want to talk about another sort of reasoning that's out there, and that's called inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is another form of reasoning well, but it is not as strong as deductive reasoning. So in deductive reasoning, if your premises are true, your conclusion, thank you for the friendly reminder. Give me 3 more minutes, Jock. So deductive reasoning, if the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. But that's not necessarily always the case in reasoning, because there's another type of reasoning where if your premises are all true, then you are almost certain, or at least very, very, very likely to get a true conclusion, but you're not guaranteed. So it's a type of reasoning which is useful and we rely on, but it's not a certainty. So what is inductive reasoning? What inductive reasoning is essentially using the past to draw conclusions about the future, or using particular cases, and a lot of them, to draw a conclusion about a future instance of that. So, for instance, how many of you believe that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Raise them high. This is a test of whether you're alive. Come on.
Yep.
Yeah. Good, good. Most of you are believing the sun is going to rise tomorrow, or I guess more accurately, the earth is going to spin on its axle and therefore it's going to look like the sun rises. So everyone agrees. Now, why do we all believe this? Why do we believe, and why are we really confident, and why is that a good conclusion to draw?
Because that happens on a daily basis.
Yeah, it happens every single time, at least in your lifetime. So yesterday it rose, sun up, the day before up, or I guess -1, -2. Basically, you look at any day in your life and the sun rose, but is it guaranteed that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Is there a 100% certainty? No. What could happen?
You live in Alaska. Have an eclipse.
Yeah, there could be an eclipse where the moon gets in the front of the way. What are some other possibilities?
Mediator?
Yeah, the sun blows up, a meteor smashes into the earth and knocks us out of gravitational orbit. There are many weird situations that could happen. So inductive reasoning is a type of reasoning of using the past to draw conclusions about the future. And it is a very good way of reasoning. However, it is not guaranteed to get you the truth in the way that deductive reasoning is. And the real feature of inductive reasoning, the way you test it, is basically inductive reasoning is better the more examples you can point to. So if I tell you that, like, here's a prediction, the next crow I see is going to be black. And I know that that's pretty damn likely because every crow I've seen in my life, and there's been like a few 100,000, there's probably a few thousand. I've probably seen a few thousand crows in my life. 20,000, I don't know. Every one of them has been black. And because of that, it means it's a likelihood that the next one will be black. It's not a guarantee because I might see an albino. There's always albinos of animals. But it's pretty damn likely. If, however, I've only ever seen one crow, then it's not a guarantee that the next crow, it's not very, like I don't have enough background history to guess pretty accurately that the next one's going to be black. It's only when you build up a lot of background. So inductive reasoning is good. To say inductive reasoning is good. With deductive, we talk in terms of validity. Inductive, we talk in terms of it being cogent. And we'll talk about these terms much more next time. So if you're not, like, don't worry about this right now. I'll start off next class by talking about the difference between these two, but I just wanted to put this down. So inductive arguments are using cases from the past to draw conclusions about the future, and they are cogent when you have a lot of cases to go on. Deductive reasoning is using two things which are guaranteed to be true to draw a conclusion that is also guaranteed to be true. So it's like 100% plus 100% equals a guaranteed conclusion. Inductive reasoning is like a 99.999% likelihood from like every other case, but there's always a chance you might be wrong. Nonetheless, it's a good way of drawing a conclusion because statistically, you're almost certain to be right. All right. So does everyone just, generally speaking, are we all doing okay with this stuff? And again, next time I'll talk a lot more about what some examples of valid arguments. All right. So for the last bit, I'm just going to share my screen and go over the homework assignment. This was the homework assignment that was due on, I guess, Saturday. As I said at the start of class, I was really happy the vast majority of people ended up in the A range. So let me figure out if I can share this. Share screen. This is the one I want. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over this homework assignment. Can everyone see the correct thing? It should just say assignment 2, what is an argument? We doing all right?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so the first one, if you lose your sense of smell, then you probably have COVID. You lost your sense of smell, therefore, you probably have COVID. This one, well, does anyone want to take a stab? Was this an argument?
Yes.
It was an argument. And the conclusion is the last sentence after the therefore. Something I want to say about therefore, because a few people asked, if there's a therefore, it's almost guaranteed to be an argument. It is incredibly rare to find a therefore that isn't an argument. Now, one thing I will say is sometimes people put a therefore in something and try to make it an argument, even though it makes no sense. So sometimes your premises and your conclusion have nothing to do with each other. In that case, it's a bad argument, but technically speaking, it's still an argument. So something like, I threw up one time, therefore I'm king of the world. That's an argument. It's just a really crappy one. But if you're looking to tell whether something's an argument, a therefore is almost a guaranteed giveaway. All right. This second one was a tough one for people. I just have a curious question. When I highlight this, does it show up? Like, can you see that I've highlighted the first sentence? All right,
Yes.
awesome.
Yeah.
So what I have highlighted right here is the conclusion of this one. I switched it up on you all. This first sentence was the conclusion. And the way you could tell this is the one that the other ones are working towards. And this is also the one that people might argue against. Gunpowder was vital to American success. What was a statement of fact about the Revolutionary War. We needed gunpowder to shoot our guns. As a matter of fact, French imports of gunpowder were incredibly large. And it was for those two facts together that made the first thing true. So that was the thing the person was trying to show, was the first thing. All right, 3. Was 3 an argument? No, it was not. 3 is just a statement. I threw up last night and it was unpleasant. 4 is not an argument. I don't cook, I don't clean, but let me tell you, I got this ring. This is just Cardi B informing you about her life. And the last statement is kind of it's not even a statement. It's more just like a sexual innuendo that she's not mentioning the details of. So this is almost not even like a statement. It's more just like here's this other thing I'm going to bring up. 5 is also not an argument. It's just 2 statements of fact. Kamala Harris is the first female vice president. She is also the first person of color who is vice president. You could turn this into an argument if you had a conclusion like, if you added a third sentence like, therefore Kamala Harris is a very special lady, that would be an argument. Number 6, just about everybody got right. In fact, I think everyone may have gotten it right. It is an argument, and the last sentence after the therefore is the conclusion. Now, number 7, I actually gave credit both ways. I was thinking of it not as an argument. I was thinking of it as just 2 statements. My fat cat ate a rat, and it got blood all over the mat. However, I can imagine a case in which this was an argument. Namely, the conclusion is my fat cat ate a rat. And my evidence for that is that if I look down and be like, oh, God damn it, there's blood all over the mat again. Therefore, the fat cat must have eaten a rat. So if you said not an argument, you got credit. If you said you did yes, an argument, you got credit.
That was the most difficult. I was like spending a lot of time thinking about that because for both sides, I was like, okay, the cat that ate a rat or showing evidence. And I was like, geez, what kind of chances will
and
I
this is an
think about?
example where I think it can be really, it's sometimes tough for me to write the questions because I have one vision in my mind, and then in the actual case, somebody else might approach it from a different way. And so sometimes it's just going to be a statement of fact, and sometimes you can interpret it as an argument. And this is really showing that the English language doesn't match perfect, or any language doesn't match up with our thoughts perfectly. So I'm glad that you all thought about that one hard. It means you're paying attention because it was a crappy question by me and everyone got full credit on it. All right, 8. Just about everyone got. It was an argument, and the conclusion is the final sentence. And 9, once again, is an argument, and final sentence after the therefore is the conclusion. So on the whole, you all did a very nice job. Oh, and then the last question, you all had some very clever examples. Everyone got at least most of the credit on that one, so good work. I was pretty lenient with it. So good work going out into the world and finding your arguments. Any questions on these? All right, well, in that case, good work to everybody. And again, you have no homework due this weekend. Just be ready. We are back to our regular Monday schedule starting next week. So just enjoy your weekend. Have a good rest of your week. And I will see you all on next Monday. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
A good one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Professor.